I'm very concerned of what's going to happen in the next election, absolutely. Well, I've been thinking about it more in terms of what needs to be done based on what we saw happen last time. I think a thing that all of us can do is support election workers and election officials. The last time around, we saw that those people stood firm, and they were, in many cases, the difference. It's clear to me, anyways, that where I've seen publicly that those people are going to be put under great pressure.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East, a sounding of the alarm from the man who investigated Donald Trump's last attempt to overturn an election in 2020. Things he warns next time could get worse, and we need to all be extra diligent in trying to protect those who administer our elections, because when it comes to Donald Trump, it seems like no affront to American democracy is off limits. Take the latest stunning new body of reporting in the New York Times that the Trump administration is putting not just the lives of election workers at risk, but the lives of all Americans at risk, because now if states don't comply with their demands, they will take action on this latest effort by Trump that essentially amounts to extortion. Quote, the Trump administration is requiring states to change the way they conduct elections or risk losing tens of millions of federal terrorism prevention funds in its latest move that would make voting harder and undermine trust in results that don't go President Trump's way. That effort would force states to transition to paper ballots, verify citizenship of voters, and make other changes to election procedures, according to Federal Emergency Management Agency documents. FEMA, part of Homeland Security, has told states that it would withhold 20% of some terrorism preparedness grants unless they provide, quote, proof of compliance with the election security measures, the documents show. The grants, which total $1 billion each year, help pay for physical barriers and other security measures, as well as planning and drill exercises and cybersecurity protections. As for those states that will likely feel this the most, the New York Times reports this, quote, the grants go largely to populous states with large urban areas, including New York, California, and Texas. New York is set to receive about $204 million in fiscal year 2026, according to the Office of Governor Kathy Hochul. Considering the law says that states are the ones who run and regulate elections, not the executive branch, this effort is likely to face a lot of legal pushback. But it does illustrate how openly brazen Donald Trump's anti-democratic efforts to rig the midterms go. This administration putting the lives of U.S. citizens at risk as it tries to undermine the midterm elections is where we begin the hour with New York Times journalists covering elections and voting for years now. Nick Corsiniti, his byline is on that reporting we've read from. Also joining us, former top DOJ official and general counsel for the FBI, our legal analyst Andrew Weissman's here, plus the founder of the Public Integrity Project and former special counsel in the Justice Department, Brendan Ballou, is back. Nick, take us through what you're reporting.
So my colleagues and I were looking at these documents known as federal proposals for funding and found some pretty fascinating requirements that were being proposed that dealt with elections. And almost every single one of them is pretty obviously going to run into legal challenges. Some have been decided by courts recently, and others are just clearly against what the Constitution lays out. And we can go through a few of them. Two of the provisions required these states to use the SAVE system. That's the system within the Department of Homeland Security that was initially built to check immigration status, that has since been retooled in the administration to try and pressure states to upload their voter rolls there to look for non-citizens. Now, a federal judge recently said states can't do that. Another judge kind of disagreed, and it's in legal question right now. But using the SAVE system to single-handedly look for non-citizens on the voter rolls has been proven to be faulty and knocked down by judges. At the same time, they're also looking to require states to use hand-marked paper ballots. Now, there are a host of jurisdictions that use hand-marked paper ballots, but certainly not all of them. And there are ADA regulations for people with disabilities who need to use election machines to, look at bigger fonts or things like that. And at the same time, these hand-marked paper ballots are still run through tabulators. So they use election machines, even though, the election conspiracy theorists on the right who might be pushing for this would not want any machines to be used. And one more thing that clearly showed that these provisions are likely to face legal challenges is that they required this 5% manual audit that was going to be described by the secretary. Now, the Constitution says that states set the time, place, and manner of elections. Congress can pass federal laws. There's nothing in there about the executive branch. That includes the president, and that includes the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. So that alone would, run against the Constitution. But also, a 5% blanket audit isn't necessarily best practices for elections. It would be, in a state like California, in a presidential election, completely unnecessary and a waste of money. That's a blue state. You don't really need a 5% audit. But in a tightly contested congressional election, a 5% audit probably isn't enough. You need a risk limiting audit, and states are good at that. So there was a lot in there that showed both a lack of understanding about elections and a lack of understanding about some of the legal consequences of these changes.
Who wrote the memo?
That is still something that we're, kind of looking at, but it's coming from the Department of Homeland Security, and it references, things and desires and plans laid out by the secretary. So my colleagues and I are still looking into, I think, a little bit more there, but it's clearly coming from the Department of Homeland Security.
I mean, to have it thrown out by a judge, would a state have to oppose it? I mean, I'm just wondering what red states will do in critical battlegrounds like Texas and Ohio. Could a governor or a secretary of state amenable to conspiracy theories adopt the measures, take the trade on terrorism dollars, and put in place illegal practices? Or will lawsuits be brought against any state that employs these proposals?
Well, as we've seen with other proposed changes to elections from the executive branch, be that, executive order, policies at the DHS, policies at the DOJ, there have been groups of Democratic states, Democratic attorneys general, outside groups like LULAC, voting rights groups. They bring these lawsuits, and federal judges sometimes bar them, countrywide. And so you could see how a lawsuit from, say, the coalition that has been suing some of these DOJ practices of Democratic state attorneys general could bring a lawsuit here. But states run their own elections. So there is a state that could adopt or may already do most of these provisions laid out. And whether that impacts their, counterterrorism dollars or not is kind of unclear, whether they want to have these state policies. But I think the requirements and the way that it's laid out is likely to face a legal challenge that could impact, the program nationwide.
Andrew Weissman, I guess if you're sort of doing this long enough, you'll see everything. And I think tying counterterrorism grants to stealing an election was a story that was never on my bingo card, even as someone who's covered Donald Trump every day for 9 years. Let me read this post from friend of the show, Miles Taylor. He posted this, quote, "If you live in a blue state, Donald Trump just put a gun to your head. He's withholding cash to stop terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, and mass shootings from states that say no to his voting rules. If the fight to protect democracy wasn't personal for you, it is now." And as we said, the grants, which total $1 billion a year, help pay for physical barriers and other security measures, as well as planning and drill exercises and cybersecurity protections.
Well, one thing that I am old enough to remember, and actually with you, Nicole, is that this sounds an awful lot like the first Trump impeachment, where there was the so-called perfect call, and it was, in my view, an extortion scheme of withholding critical, we now realize how critical, funds to Ukraine to defend itself. And here we're talking about the same thing. And in Ukraine's case, it was to just announce an investigation of what he thought was going to be and correctly, his political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. And here it's to coerce states to do something that legally, directly, they have not been required to do under the law. I will say that I'm enough of a cynic to think that this is kind of a win-win from the administration, because they either will have the states concede and do this, and that may be very well with red states. And in blue states that don't do this, I think it is clear we're going to see this again when the administration, when they lose in those states, says there was fraud and you didn't do the things that we were saying that you needed to do. And they're going to use that as part of their sort of unilateral claims of fraud in the midterms and in elections going forward. Because we can see now that they're perfectly willing to make any and all claims, regardless of law and regardless of facts. So in many ways, I think this is just a very cynical move on the part of the administration.